Serial gateway. In this module, we'll take a look on what a serial gateway is and how to configure it. If you still have some devices in your network with a serial port, you might need to have a serial gateway to be able to talk to those devices. In short, basically, a serial gateway takes a bunch of serial ports on the one hand side to connect serial devices to it and makes it available on the TCP/IP network so that DataMiner is able to connect to it. Because DataMiner is typically running on a VM or maybe on a bare metal, but still it doesn't have any serial ports, so you need some kind of third-party equipment to be able to have those serial ports available in your network. Now let's take a look at that. So the serial gateway, first of all, we'll have a quick introduction on what it's about. Then we'll dive into the accessing of the serial gateway because it's typically on my technical network, so a couple of small notes there. And then the most important thing is the configuration, which basically consists out of configuring the operating mode and the serial ports itself. Do note that I will use a specific brand of serial gateway, but it doesn't really matter which kind of serial gateway you have. It typically works the same way. You have to make sure that the operating mode is correct and you have to configure the serial ports in here. Those two things typically come back at any brand you choose. So first of all, the DataMiner system, we typically run on a VM or on a bare metal, but these days they don't really have any serial ports anymore. So to be able to talk to devices with a serial interface, we need to be able to have some kind of serial gateway, as we call it. So we have various brands of vendors that are supplying a serial gateway. It basically has a bunch of serial ports and makes it available on the TCP/IP network so that DataMiner is able to talk to it. That's what we call a so-called peripheral. It does a medium conversion from IP to serial. You also have like I/O gateways that's being used to measure I/O contacts, or you could have an HMS gateway or also a GPIP gateway, these kind of things. So that's what we need, and in this case we are talking about the serial gateway. Now if we take a look at the serial gateway, as I mentioned, DataMiner goes over the TCP/IP network towards the serial gateway, to the IP address of the serial gateway. And we will typically identify a specific TCP/IP port to be able to connect to one of the many serial ports that are available on the serial gateway. So you could have like different flavors with only 1 or 2 or 4, 8, up to 16, 32 serial ports on there. So, and in this case, we will use the Moxa device, and by default, they will use 4001 as the port, the entryway to connect to the first serial port. 4002 will be the second, 4003, the third, etc. serial ports. So typically we use a Moxa device, as I said, so it's like a rack-mounted device. You plug it in, you connect it to the TCP/IP network, configure it with an IP address, and you can start hooking up some serial devices to the 16 or 32 serial ports you have at the back. So this, of course, has some advantages that basically your serial devices become available on the TCP/IP network. So if you have a bunch of serial devices in a rack somewhere, you do all the cabling, you connect it to the serial gateway, and it is available on the TCP/IP network. So whenever DataMiner is, for instance, doing a failover to another node, it can still just do the polling because it's just polling over the TCP/IP network and no rewiring is necessary. So if you still have some serial devices, make sure they are nicely connected onto the network with a serial gateway. Typically these days the serial gateway have some kind of web interface. If it's a more basic one, it could be a telnet. But typically we will look at two things that we will need to configure there. That's the operating settings and also the serial settings. But first of all, we need to be able to connect to it. And to be able to connect to it, we have to keep into account that you might have a DataMiner agent which is connected to two different networks. And typically I am connected to the corporate network and entering the DataMiner system from the northbound here. Southbound, we are connecting to all the equipment on the acquisition or technical network. If your serial gateway is over there, yeah, you need to make sure that you have access over there. If you don't have access, you could do just a remote desktop onto the DataMiner agent and connect from there to the serial gateway, or you need to make sure you have some kind of like route that is basically going to that acquisition LAN to be able to connect to that. There's a small note here, that's just a technicality on TCP/IP networking. If you have separate networks, also make sure that the IP address on the first and the second network interface are effectively in a different subnet. Otherwise, the operating system could be confused how to access certain equipment. Anyhow, there's also a small note here. If that would be needed, you are able actually to configure the server, the Windows operating system we're running on, to act as a router or a gateway. So you can do that by activating the remote and the routing and remote access service in Windows. And then you could basically configure, let me show you, your client, which is on the 14 network here, to have the gateway configured onto the DataMiner agents. And whenever we want to access another IP address range or another subnet, it will go through that gateway. And since we activated the routing and remote access service, it will nicely bring me to that network, which is in another subnet, for instance. So just to make you aware that that is possible if that would be required. But the easiest thing could be to just do a remote desktop if you don't have access already. Now, to go into the configuration, as I mentioned, we are using the Moxa here as an example, but other vendors are basically using the same principles. The first thing that we have to make sure is that our device is immediately, I would say, whenever we take it out of the box, we make sure that the operating mode of every port on that machine or on that device is configured on what we call TCP server modes. So the operating mode, it means that sometimes you can have certain ports that are working in like a real COM mode and connecting to some kind of like driver you need to install, or it could be in a client mode. We really need all the ports that we need to connect to be able or to function as a TCP server. So basically, it's a server waiting for incoming connections, and DataMiner is able to connect to it. So the Moxa needs to be the server, and we need to be able to connect to it whenever we want. If it's not listening and we are not able to connect to it, we will get the socket error 10,061. So if you ever see the socket error 10,061, it means that it actively refused the connection. It's not listening. So we're not able to connect to it. That's typically what happens. There is although a second possibility to have that 10,061, and that is whenever there is already somebody connected on that socket. So if it is listening and somebody, another DataMiner agent or another system is connecting to it, then it's possible that DataMiner is not able to connect to it anymore. And again, we will have that 10,061, the socket error, which means that it actively refused the connection. You do have the possibility in the monitor option of the Moxa interface to actually see who is already connected to it. So that's a small tip. It is technically possible to configure the maximum number of connections to more than one. By default here it is on one, so only one DataMiner agent or one system can connect to that port. It is technically possible to allow more than one connection, but since we're talking about serial communication and there is no collision detection, we have to avoid that, because otherwise you could be sending commands from different sources and you will have some collisions and some things that are not going wrong, correctly there. So it's advised to leave that on one. So remember, you need to configure Immediately from all of your ports, I would say, you need to configure it on TCP server mode. So TCP server mode, that's the thing you immediately need to do. The 10,061 might indicate you forgot about it, or there might already be somebody else connected to it, which you can verify in the monitor. Next thing I need to do, and this will depend on which device you are connecting to which port. For every port that you start to use, you need to configure the serial settings in here. So in here you can see you can configure the baud rate, data bits, stop bits, all these kind of things can be configured in here. This will of course depend on the device and what the device supports. So if you hook up a device, you're not able to configure the baud rate in DataMiner. You need to configure that in the serial gateway. So here in the serial gateway, you can actually also give every port an alias so that you can give it a nice name, which device is connected there, configure all the settings as needed, and then you can add the element in DataMiner. Also with the monitor, you were able to see which which systems are connected to it, but also here you can in the async monitor see the packets going back and forwards in here, just as a small tip. So remember, serial gateway, very easy device, but you might need it for hooking up some serial equipment you still might have out there. And there are two things you need to configure. First of all, for every port, you can immediately put it on TCP server mode. And then for every single port you hook up a device, you need to make sure that baud rates, data bits, stop bits, and these kind of serial settings are correctly configured. So that's about it. Up for the next one.